Have you ever wanted to include Native American characters in your fictional stories, but hesitated, afraid you might get it wrong? Well, I am hosting a free masterclass called How to Earn Readers' Trust Through Accurately Portraying Native American Characters Without the Fear of Getting It Wrong. In this live session, I'll show you how to write with accuracy, respect, and confidence so that you can tell the stories on your heart without second-guessing yourself. It's happening November 18th at 12 p.m. Central Standard Time. You can reserve your free spot. This is a free masterclass over at fictioncourses.com/masterclass. That's fictioncourses.com/masterclass. Hey there, my fellow author. I'm Sarah Elizabeth Sawyer, an old soul kind of writer living my dream as a full-time author and authorpreneur. But I didn't start out living a confident, creative lifestyle. I struggled with the fears and the mental and emotional barriers that so often plague writers at all stages of their author career. But the truth is that with the right knowledge, tools, and training, you can overcome those barriers. I'm here to teach you how I've developed a lifestyle that's allowed me to publish 19 books and counting. Each week, as you tune into the Confident Fiction Author podcast, you'll get clarity on the steps you need to take to advance your writing career. Whether it's developing your ideal writing routine, tackling new skills like dictating your fiction, or overcoming the obstacles life throws your way, this podcast will help you live a more confident, creative lifestyle. Let's get started. Hey there, my friend, and welcome to this episode of the Confident Fiction Author Podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Elizabeth Sawyer, and today we are going to explore research tips for you when you're writing about another culture. Because honestly, as fiction authors, we're natural explorers, right? We chase stories into new worlds, into new eras, new cultures, maybe even new planets. But when it comes to researching a culture that isn't your own, it's easy to feel lost. Like, where's the map? How do I get through here? Or maybe you do have a map and it's in another language and you just feel like you don't even know where to begin. So today I've just got some practical tips for you on how to research another culture, how to really approach that research in a good way and in an authentic and respectful way, and really how to avoid the most common mistakes authors make when researching for their novels. So by the end of this episode, I just want you to feel equipped to step into that research with confidence and not feeling lost and not feeling maybe even some trepidation, some fear around researching your stories. So let's get into it. Research. As a historical fiction author, I could harp on this all day long. I've given entire presentations on how to research your stories. And it's something that I certainly practice. I've practiced it for pretty much the whole 15 years of my career as a fiction author, and certainly from the time of publishing my first book back in 2013, which was titled Touch My Tears, Tales from the Trail of Tears. So I did that with 9 other authors. We did Choctaw removal stories, from removal from our homeland to Indian Territory, what became the state of Oklahoma. So I started on this journey of research many years ago, and that, honestly, I'll just tell you that story. Before I did that book was a part of my program with the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. I was in their Artist in Leadership program, and as part of that program, I spent 2 weeks in Washington, D.C., and I spent the majority of that time doing research. I got to handle Choctaw artifacts and documents, papers, paintings. It was just incredible, an incredible research trip. And part of my program was bringing that home to my community in Durant, Oklahoma. That's one of my communities. That's around where my papaw was born, actually. And then he moved down to Fort Worth in his young years. And That's where my mom was born. So we live in Texas, but we do have deep roots in Oklahoma. So I brought all of that research back to Durant, or Durant, as my papa would say, and invited Choctaws from anywhere. And I had Choctaws come from 5 different states. It was incredible. We had a wonderful group, and then I invited them into this anthology that became Touch My Tears and was my first book. So I was teaching them I was showing them all the research that I had gathered. Well, not all of it. We took over 5,000 images, but I pared it down and showed them especially the objects that we were able to observe and handle. So it was an incredible experience. And that was foundational for me with my fiction writing and for all of the books that came after it. But it was by no means comprehensive or the end of my research. So I continue to research to this day to really get that accuracy. And that's what I want to talk to you first about here, is how accuracy builds trust. And if you are writing fantasy, or maybe you're writing thriller or action adventure and you're like, accuracy isn't all that important, let me challenge you on that. Even if you're writing fantasy, I have seen where stereotypes or just things that feel off make its way into fantasy cultures, and lacking that accuracy can damage that credibility that you have with your readers. If they know the culture, or if it comes out later in a review and someone's like, this is so off, I can't believe the author did this. And not that we're writing to please everyone, because that's not going to happen, but inaccuracy can cause those credibility issues. And really, I think the heart of most authors, I'm thinking you, since you're listening to this podcast, is that you want to portray those cultures that you're writing about in the best ways that you can, not glorifying them. I'm not talking about that, but just being accurate. And I think whenever you hit those points and you get that kind of feedback from your readers who really appreciate it, that builds trust not only with your readers, but it builds your own confidence as an author. So having that accuracy in your stories comes from that research. And yes, it does take a lot of time and work. I have very personal experience with that over the past 15 years, but I have also found that it's always worth it. The other thing that I have found is research fuels my story ideas. Like, I'll have kind of a vague idea of what I'm wanting to write and maybe some of the characters that I want to put in there. But it's not until I start digging into especially for me as a historical fiction author, I start digging into the time period and I'm like, oh, a fire, a tornado. Like, how can I work these into my story? Or how can maybe like this be the climax? And for my most recent book and my last book in the Choctaw Tribune series, I really was doing a research on the Dawes Commission and all that turn of the century history and allotments. And as I was reading through one of my research books, I was like, oh, this is how these characters can meet. And this is how really what they can be joining forces on to combat. And this is how they draw closer and all of these things. And like, this is what's going to drive the entire story. And so a lot of times when I have a block around a particular book, like this book, I've been thinking about it literally for years, and now I'm finally writing it, is what I find is if I'm blocked, I'm kind of stuck. Like, what should I write about? Like, what is the plot? What is the story here? Like, I have the time period, and I kind of generally know what needs to happen, but how do I get this into an outline? What does this practically look like? And research is really what guides me at that point. And that goes way beyond historical fiction. If you're writing in contemporary times, if you are writing a thriller with a different culture and you're wanting to feature that culture and you're writing this thriller, like doing the research into that culture can inspire maybe some of your best plot twists. All right, so we have established that research matters. It is important. Now, where do you start? And I'm going to be honest, this was something that held me up for a little bit when I was getting into it. And I was like, okay, research, what does that actually look like? And how do you approach these mounds and mounds of information and distill that down into your outline and into your story. And where do you even start? What's the entry point into research for some of these? So generally where I like to start is with books. So I will start looking up the topic that I'm wanting to research and looking for the best books on that topic. So when I was writing my World War I novel, The Choctaw Code Talkers of World War I, it's called Anumpa Warrior or Word Warrior, so language warrior, I was like, I didn't know really anything about World War I. I love history and I knew a good bit of World War II history, but like most people in the world, and especially in America, it's like it was really the forgotten war. And I generally knew the dates and I knew the 100-year anniversary of the ending of the war was coming up. And I really wanted the Choctaw Code Talker story to be a part of that. So I started researching and I was like, oh yeah, the war ended November 11, 1918. So that's why we have Veterans Day on November 11th. So salute to our veterans. But I knew almost nothing beyond that about World War I. And so I started diving in and I started looking for some of the best books on World War I. I also was looking for movies. Not that I was going to rely on the accuracy of those movies, but I just wanted to get some visual and get some feel for what it was like in that war. And really, though, what did it for me was finding photographs of the war and finding stories and letters and reports. That's what really gave me the full history or the full view that I needed of the war in order to write this accurately. So finding books on it, especially biographies, autobiographies, and oral histories. So I look for any kind of recordings around that history. For instance, with the Choctaw Code Talkers, there was a project done where some of their descendants were interviewed and they shared the stories and the little anecdotes that their family member who was a code talker had shared with them, and those found their way into the books. So oral histories, I love just listening to those stories and knowing that I also have to match my research up with it, but it's a fantastic starting point and just to get those authentic little tidbits that you can include in your story to draw the readers in while giving them an accurate piece of that culture. The other thing I do love looking for are books by members of that culture, so people who are from that culture, reading books that they wrote, especially if it's history book. And if you're writing contemporary, it's still good to know the history of the culture you're writing about. In fact, I would say I don't want to say it's mandatory, but it is really important that you know the history, even if you're writing contemporary, because that history so heavily influences these cultures because they're built by layers, just decade after decade and hundreds of years of history to develop your character and your story world that you're writing about today in this year. So reading books that have been written by members of that culture, if you can, if it's history books, if it's contemporary, if it's biography. So you want to read into those and also know that when you're reading any of these books that they're all going to have their biases, whether it's for or against the culture or the history that you're researching. There are going to be biases, so you're going to want to read from varied sources, people inside and outside the culture, to put together the story world and the characters that you are wanting to create. Another great place to start beyond books and maybe some movies are museums and archives and cultural centers. Oh my goodness. Like I said, I spent 2 weeks in DC as a part of the program with the National Museum of the American Indian, the NMAI, which is a museum and it's also an archive. So we got to go out to their archives center, the Museum Resources Center, and research things that were not on display at the museums. And that was so incredible because I was able to, hold a blowgun which was a hunting device that the Choctaws used in ancient times. So there's just nothing quite that replaces that feel, that textual feel of actually diving into the objects of another culture. And one way you can do this, like I mentioned, cultural centers, sometimes they will have classes and demonstrations where they will let you handle items that give you that sensory details and just that connection. There's something about going to a location that you're going to be writing about. For me, like I said, lots of trips to Oklahoma and all over Oklahoma, and doing pottery classes and doing beading classes. All of those contribute to my research and ultimately make their way naturally into my stories. So museums, archives, cultural centers, get to know the people there. I mean, you're an author. Yes, you're a fiction author, and sometimes we feel like, oh, I'm not doing an academic study. I'm not a professor. I'm not writing a history book. Just know you are writing a book and you are an author, and it is just as important for you to get this information as if you were writing a book specifically about that culture or about its history. So get to know these people and build relationships. Let them know what you're writing about and your heart behind what you're wanting to do with your story. And often that helps you go what I like to call going beneath the glass. So going under the museum glass and actually getting to examine these items up close and getting to handle them and getting to know some of the insider information about that history and that culture that you might not have known about otherwise. So those places are really great to find people like that. And guess what? They generally love to talk about it because that's why they're there. They're working at a museum or at an archive because they love research, they love preserving this, and they love sharing it with other people. So books, primary sources from oral histories and biographies and books by the members of that culture, and then going to museums, archives, and cultural centers are all great places to start your research. Now, I want to come close and talk about this, and I'm thinking specifically with Native American, but this is going to apply for cultures around the world, whatever that other culture is that you're not a part of, or even if you are a part of that culture. One of the things I want to encourage you to do is to respect boundaries and know that some things are not for fiction. It's not for including even a nonfiction. It's not to be put out there to the public. And I'm thinking specifically, there were some items at the NMAI at the Resources Center that I did get to see, but I won't be writing about those things. There are some things that are to be kept within a culture. And as far as where those boundaries are, you're going to get multiple opinions. Some people are like, yeah, it's okay to write about that. And some people are like, don't you dare. So it's really getting in there and respecting those boundaries whenever you discover like, hey, this is something that I learned, but I really shouldn't put this into fiction. And I know of a specific incident with a popular TV show where that came out. There was a ceremony that was performed in a scene, and some people, even though it was done by someone in that culture, other people in the culture really objected to it being done. So understanding those boundaries, and then ultimately you will have to make your own judgment call when you're writing fiction. It's something that I've had to do with my Native American characters and my study of the culture, and really just understanding that it is important to at least learn the boundaries and learn what the thought processes are with those and respecting them when you can, and knowing that just some things you have to let go of and it just doesn't belong in your story. Okay, the other thing I want to say, I mentioned about the biases that all authors typically have, whether they're writing history books, they're writing about that culture, whatever it is. They are often cherry picking things that they want to prove a certain theory about, or they're, have a certain worldview that they're wanting to pour into. I encourage you with your fiction to be careful about cherry picking things that are just for your plot. Like you're like, oh, I like that mindset, or I like that artifact, or I like, just these little bits and random pieces. And so you're just kind of cherry picking and shoehorning things into your plot. And there are times for that. as far as like you just want to include a bit of this culture and you're like, I just want to have the mother and daughter sitting down and doing some bead work. So there are some things that you can like just have these little snapshots or little tiny bits that you're putting in your story. But I just want to encourage you to have a balanced viewpoint as well. So if it is something that is negative or positive about that culture, like not only portraying those things, not only portraying the negative, and then also not just portraying the positive. So I really think it's important that we have the full story when we're portraying other cultures. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in just a minute. But just thinking about, cherry picking things for your plot, be really mindful of, your intention behind that and how it fits into your story and how it's reflecting on that culture. I've got just a couple of practical tips for you here. Always keep a research notebook or a research notes on your phone. That's something I have for all of my series. I just kind of title the note. I'll just put Choctaw Tribune series. And then when I have research questions or I come across a great tidbit, like I'm always just throwing them into that one note. I know a lot of authors like to carry a notebook. So if you're going to be keeping it in a notebook, take that notebook with you everywhere because you're always going to have something percolating in your mind that you have a question that you want to ask a museum curator, or you've come across this tidbit or something, it just all of a sudden comes together in your head. You want to have your research notebook handy so that you can grab those notes as they come to you. As you're doing your research, I encourage you to cross-check your information with at least 2 sources. So I mentioned when you're doing research books and you're reading, read from inside the culture and outside of it. And on the last podcast episode, episode 44, and I talked about writing, I talked a lot about sensitivity readers and should you have a sensitivity reader? And this is something that when I'm talking about cross-checking with 2+ sources, not relying just on that one person, just that one sensitivity reader, or even a couple of sensitivity readers, but they kind of have the same mindset or background. Like have diverse sources that you're checking with and that you're cross-referencing that information and that culture so that you make sure you're not getting just one person's opinion or just their research or just their background when you're doing your research. And I already mentioned this, but do avoid the Hollywood or Wikipedia shortcuts. Dig deeper than that because those are often just perpetuating stereotypes or incorrect history. So be sure and go to the sources as much as possible. Some pitfalls to avoid. Again, thinking about one voice representing the whole culture and one aspect representing the whole culture. So when I talk about cherry picking or maybe just having one sensitivity reader, like you want to think about having that multiple input, whether it's research books, humans, primary sources, whatever it is, your own experiences, like don't rely on just one voice or one input source to represent the entire culture. Another pitfall to avoid is romanticizing a culture or villainizing a culture. So this is so prominent with American Indians. They're either these idyllic children of the forest, utopia prior to European contact, and it's just very romanticized, or it's the other extreme and they were just heathen savages out to scalp everyone. So we have the two extremes, and it shows up still so often, even in today's media, where typically it's romanticized nowadays, and it's not showing the entire culture and representing all of the history and really pulling all of those pieces together. So those are a couple of pitfalls to avoid, and I talk a lot more about that in my other trainings around writing American Indians. I'll share here in just a minute. But it's just really important to remember to not rely on just that one voice to represent an entire culture, and to also be cautious about glorifying or overly romanticizing a particular culture. There's nothing wrong with having that authentic, deep, genuine respect for a culture, but just we know that no human race, no culture is perfect, and we want to have that complete view when we go into writing our characters. Wrapping up here, I want to say that research doesn't have to overwhelm you. It can actually inspire you and even energize you and just make your stories stronger. So I hope that this isn't leaving you with a feeling of overwhelm of, oh, I have to do all of these things. Remember, I've had over a decade of experience, really my whole life of experience in absorbing my own culture and American Indian culture, and then just learning how to absorb and research things that I'm not familiar with or that I have not experienced myself. So if you're just getting started as a fiction author, or if you are an experienced fiction author, but you're really wanting to go deeper into a particular culture, maybe that's something you're wanting to branch into and you're like, this is overwhelming. I just want to encourage you that it is so worth it, and it can energize you and give you those best plot twists and really give your readers the powerful emotional experience that they're looking for when they pick up your book. If you would like to go deeper into how to research specifically Native American characters and how to write them, I do invite you to check out my course, Fiction Writing American Indians. That's over at fictioncourses.com/American Indians. I go deep into all of the things we covered here and more so that you can walk away feeling confident in including Native American characters in your stories. That is all for this episode, my friend. Like I said in the previous one, we don't have a word for goodbye in Choctaw. We say Chipi Salachiki. I will see you again soon. Take care.